couple of weeks after I had planted my first tomato bed, I built a second one and planted it with a few cherry tomato seedlings I had laying around. After some days, they looked wildly different.
It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. This certainly is a tale of two tomato beds. One looks beautiful, vigorous, growing at its full potential, and the other is completely destroyed. Well, first let's take a look at the worst one. This only underscores how important timing is to gardening, because I planted these about 2 to 3 weeks later than that one, and the tomatoes suffered because of that. They were already bad seedlings to begin with, but I still put them in trying to see what would happen. Well, what happened is some kind of animal ate all the tomato leaves, especially the small ones. It just becomes more intriguing. I don't know if this is groundhogs or some other herbivorous, or even an insect maybe, was eating the tips of the tomatoes, only the really tender ones, and probably the weak ones, because on the other side where I have really stout tomatoes, they look picture perfect, and that really bothers me. I wish I knew what was happening here. I did put this cage here. I'll probably try to cover up the other ones to see if they'll recover. I just know that with that kind of head start, this is never going to catch up. I just hope to be proven wrong. Let's see. An absolutely, completely different story on this side. I have beautiful tomatoes with beautiful leaves and stout stems, and even they're starting to set up flowers and probably will start fruiting soon, which makes me wonder, will they be at the mercy of the same fate of those if whatever ate those decides to attack this? I can't think that this is groundhogs, because from all my years of experience dealing with groundhogs, they don't usually bother tomato leaves. They'll eat tomatoes when they're kind of green, turning red, or when they're red, but they usually don't even eat them all, so they must not like them that much, unless it's a desperate animal that's just looking for anything to eat. I feel like it's something else that might have done that to the really small tomatoes, and it had happened to the tomato in the bottom on the other side there. It had suffered a similar fate, but not as fatal. They only ate the central tip, but it's starting to regain strength. It hasn't regained as much vigor as these, possibly also because these are in front and they're kind of shading that one. But we'll see if I get a good tomato harvest. This looks promising, but until you have the tomato in your hand, you can't really count your tomatoes by the flowers they start giving out.
What really confuses me about this mysterious agent is that usually animals like groundhogs like to eat the best specimens with the most vigorous verdant leaves. Attacking the weak, spindly seedlings is just not something I have witnessed before. It could be an insect such as a tomato cutworm, or maybe even a slug. They could be responsible for the demise. Insects and bugs sometimes attack the weaker plants that happen to produce less protective chemical compounds. But at the same time, putting the structures around the growing vines seemed to have worked. It could have been coincidence, but I just hoped that at least the strong vines would end up producing something. I'll be back right after this commercial. About a month later, by July, my tomato plants looked phenomenal. I could not believe my eyes.
I have to do something about these tomatoes here. They're really taking over everything. The leaves are beautiful, and you might think, okay, they have way too much nitrogen. They're growing too big of leaves. And while I can't for sure say it's not true, that perhaps putting too much nitrogen promotes bigger leaves and not enough fruit set, all I have to say is that there are a lot of fruit already set growing. There are big ones, and there's plenty of flowers, and they seem to be setting fruit well. so they might have enough phosphorus and potassium. That is with me basically putting layers of grass clippings over this. I'm sure that my soil is already pretty fertile. I wouldn't doubt that. But at the same time, I wonder if when you put vegetable matter like green leaves, if there's actually enough nitrogen to cause a problem like manure or synthetic fertilizer. Perhaps that's not the case. Who knows? I would have to make a more systematic scientific testing to know for sure. But all in all, I know that my system is working pretty well. What I'd like to see is that there's very little sign of disease and wilt. Of course, that can change from one day to the next, especially in very hot and humid weather. That's one thing that tomatoes are notorious for, is just wilting from one week to the next. That being said, of course, I'm going to continue putting grass clippings as my mulch and fertilizer for the tomatoes and see where that leads me. But one thing I need to do immediately is to support them in a more effective way. I did want to use these twig towers that I built, but because they take a little bit of time to build, and I haven't had much time having to build the other beds and having to take care of other things in the property, I haven't had time to just stop and construct or weave these towers. They look nice, but the tomatoes have already grown them, and it's the beginning of July. I know that if everything goes right and no major disease attacks the plants, I should have tomatoes producing up until November. That means they're going to want to grow much larger. For that, I'll need to build or at least jerry-rig, another structure for them. I'll use some of the twigs I had cut from from other trimmings that I did in the property, and I'll use those and just tie them rustically together and have a rustic tower that hopefully will be able to support the growing tomatoes so that they can be off the ground and less likely to rot. Keeping your tomatoes supported is essential. The farther away from the ground you can keep them, the more chances of success you have. And also, I can't stress this enough, actually keeping the soil mulched is essential to prevent certain soil-borne diseases that can affect the growth of tomatoes. Once raindrops fall into the soil and it splashes back into the leaves, and you have fungal issues growing in the leaves. Keeping things tidy in that sense of keeping the soil covered so that the plant is healthy is paramount to having good tomatoes.
All in all, if your greatest problem with your tomato plants is finding a way to support the growing vines that are too heavy for their own good, you know you are winning. Get your tomatoes going with the right foot and they will succeed. If they get stressed by pest attacks or the weather, like my other bed, they will take a while to rebound and may even perish. But to summarize, here are some of my secrets to growing tomatoes. Start with the soil. If your soil is sandy or clay-like, add organic matter in the form of compost or composted leaves. You want a soil that can retain water without getting boggy. I happen to win the lottery with soil, so all I need to do is to keep it fertile by adding grass clippings every week. They protect the soil, aid in the soil life, and fertilize all at once. There is no reason to be afraid of high nitrogen from grass clippings, in my opinion. If you were a tomato plant, you would want to have large leaves to harvest a lot of energy from the sun. While there are tips out there to trim and train tomatoes to have less leaves to produce more fruit, I think it's a bit of a high maintenance hassle. I don't dispute that they may help you get more fruit, but it takes a lot more effort to keep up with, and sometimes I'm just lazy. Another important secret is to make sure your soil has adequate phosphorus and potassium. If plants are languishing and not flowering at all, add a good organic fertilizer. But if your plants are doing well like mine are, there is no reason to add anything extra, as excess nutrients can run off and cause pollution in rivers and bays. Lots of compost is usually enough. The more organic matter, the better. Remember that. If you want to know my other secrets to growing tomatoes and see what happened to my vines this year, don't miss my next episode. See you there.